Hi, everybody. This is our first lesson in U.S. History 1865 all the way up to hopefully the 2000s. And today we're going to be talking about reconstructing the Union, and our president that we're going to be discussing today is Andrew Johnson. So first we want to start out with our learning targets. What do we want to learn about this Reconstruction era? Well, first of all, we want to learn about the causes and effects of Reconstruction. Everything's going to be based around that. And we're going to ask a couple of questions to guide our learning. First of all, we want to learn, what did Reconstruction policies really attempt to do? And the two things that they did attempt to do that we're going to discuss are, we're going to rebuild the Union after the Civil War because things are really bad and torn up. We're going to rebuild the lives for African Americans after the condition of slavery and the emancipation, which freed them from slavery. We're going to talk about what the federal government tried to do to support emancipation. And then, what did Reconstruction result in? Unfortunately, it resulted in a lot of conflict and mistrust in the government, and it also resulted in a couple of failures to help African Americans gain full equality. So everything that we do in this lesson will be built around those learning targets. What did Reconstruction's policies attempt to do? And what did they result in? And this is our first day, and we're just going to get an overview of the information. So first of all, let's start with rebuilding the United States. So a group of Republicans had kind of taken over the Congress, and these Republicans were called the Radical Republicans. And so that word radical gives us a really good indication of what these Republicans were like. They were kind of extreme in their views on what they wanted to do to rebuild the United States. And one of their views was, some of these radical Republicans wanted to punish the South for the Civil War. And so they didn't want Reconstruction to be a very easy process. President Lincoln, before his assassination, he wanted to forgive and he wanted to move forward. He didn't want to try and hold a lot of grudges. And so his plan for Reconstruction was rather forgiving. He had this plan that, if 10% of the population would swear an oath to the Constitution, that we could bring those people back into the Union, we could get our nation back together, and we could move forward. However, when Lincoln was assassinated, that plan died with him. And so the radicals, feeling very bitter about the Civil War, the destruction of the Civil War, and the recent assassination of President Lincoln, the Republican president, their reaction to this is going to be rather harsh. And so their Reconstruction Act did not make it very easy for the South to come back into the Union. And so the South was divided up into 5 military districts. It was put under military law. And those southern states had to do certain things to get back into the Union. They had to write a brand new constitution to get rid of all those old slave laws called slave codes. They had to approve the 14th and 13th Amendments. And so once they did those things, they could essentially prove to the Congress that they were ready to come back into the Union. Unfortunately, getting those things done proved to be more difficult than I think the radicals anticipated. Another goal of Reconstruction was rebuilding the lives of African Americans. So the Civil War has ended. Lincoln emancipated the slaves. These people are now free. And so we want to make sure that they can have a life of freedom and that they have equality. And this is a difficult thing, given that in the South for so many years that African Americans have been under this yoke of slavery and have been treated less than people and treated essentially as property. And so one of the ways that the Congress wanted to institute and codify, put into law this new status for African Americans was by passing amendments. The 13th Amendment was passed that freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment was passed, which made them citizens. And the Congress wanted the southern states to approve both of these to ensure that African Americans could have an equal status. Also, they created a bureau for freedmen, for the recently freed slaves, called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau's purpose was to help African Americans achieve a new status, to give them education, to provide them some medical care, to give them some legal advice. All of these things were designed to help African Americans make new lives away from those slave systems they had been living in. And the Freedmen's Bureau did its best work through education in those freedmen's schools. Then in 1866, the Congress wanted to go even farther than the 13th and 14th Amendment and passed something called the Civil Rights Act, which was intended to prevent discrimination, which was intended to promote a more equal status for African Americans. However, the Civil Rights Act is going to be overturned by the Supreme Court of the United States in a very famous case, Plessy versus Ferguson. And what Plessy versus Ferguson will essentially say is that segregation, separate but equal, is lawful. You can have separate schools for African Americans and whites. You can have separate eating facilities, separate transportation services. As long as they're equal, that's lawful. We will not have another Civil Rights Act in our nation for almost 100 years, and Plessy versus Ferguson will become a very powerful ruling that will be used by southern states to segregate people for many, many years. So unfortunately, that was kind of a failure. That gets us into our effects of Reconstruction. So one of the effects of the Reconstruction era, due to the bitterness of the Republicans, was conflict and mistrust. So after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson became president. He was the vice president, but he was from Tennessee, and these radicals just really did not trust Andrew Johnson. They saw him as a Southern sympathizer, that he was going to make it easy on the South to come back in the Union. And he did have some views and did make some speeches that were a little bit alarming. And so in order to protect the integrity of the government, the radicals passed something called the Tenure of Office Act. And this said that Andrew Johnson could not fire any of Lincoln's cabinet members. And this was specifically intended to keep the people that Lincoln had appointed in office and to keep the government going in the direction that Lincoln wanted it to go, instead of taking it in another direction that Johnson may want it to go, that would create an easier path for the South to get back in the Union. And so President Johnson, he didn't really get along very well with the Secretary of War, Henry Stanton. And so after several disagreements, Andrew Johnson fired Henry Stanton, the Secretary of War, and this led to an impeachment trial in which the Congress brought charges against Andrew Johnson, several charges. I think there were like 11 articles of impeachment, might have been 14, in which, and you're going to do a little activity on this later, so you'll be able to check me on that, in which they said that Andrew Johnson had broken the law. He had violated the Tenure of Office Act. He had made speeches that were disrespectful to the office of the presidency, and he had brought disrespect upon the government by some of the things that he said. And so he was impeached. In fact, he was impeached twice. However, they did not get the votes to throw him out of office, so he remained president. However, the Congress was terribly divided over the impeachment trial. The president didn't trust the Congress didn't trust the president, and things just kind of came to a standstill on how to progress forward for a little while. The last issue with Reconstruction or effect was the failure to help African Americans gain full equality. We've already talked about what the Civil Rights Act intended to do and what it failed to do. So that was one of the major failures. However, the formation of the KKK was a really big problem for African Americans in the South, because it was a terror organization intended to control the voting of African Americans, to control their movement, to control their attitudes. And so the Ku Klux Klan becomes a very serious threat to the freedom of African Americans during this time. And many African Americans will get caught in an economic system that is very close to slavery, called sharecropping and tenant farming. And we're going to learn a little bit more about how close that is to slavery later when we look at a sharecropping contract. So I hope that you learned a little bit about the causes and effects of Reconstruction, what it did and what it didn't do, how it failed to really rebuild the United States very well, to rebuild the lives for African Americans, resulted in some conflict, and also failed to help African Americans achieve full equality. So we will see you next time on the next lesson, which will be all about President Grant and Reconstruction.